The faith group, one of the most common sources of comfort for the dying and the bereaved, paradoxically can often be the least comforting, actually causing alienation. In the pediatric hospital where I served, I was once with a mom whose transgender child had been assaulted. Luckily, he didn't die, but he was hospitalized with severe injuries. The mom told me she was a born-again Christian, but she didn't have any issues with her child. She loved him. He is the way he is, the way God made him, she told me. I asked her if she was finding support in her evangelical church. She told me she was not able to tell them about what had happened to her son because she was not able to tell them about her son. I gave her as much support as I could and referred to her a list of more liberal Christian churches where I felt like she and her son would both be supported. When my mother was dying on hospice, she agreed to a visit from the hospice chaplain. This was many years before I had any notion of becoming a hospice chaplain myself. The Roman Catholic Church had excommunicated my mother several decades earlier when she had divorced and remarried. My stepdad was Lutheran, so eventually my mom wound up just going to church with him. But she missed her church. She still felt Catholic. She was still technically Catholic, but she was denied the sacraments, including Holy Communion. Fast forward several decades to her time in hospice. Mere months to live. She was disenfranchised from her own faith, which should have been a support to her at that time. So she agreed to a visit from the hospice chaplain, and I was there with her when he came to visit her at her house. I recall he was a Baptist. He wasn't horrible, but he wasn't a great chaplain either. I guess he gave me an idea of what not to do as a chaplain, although I didn't realize it at the time. After a short time of visiting with her, he asked her, a big no-no in chaplaincy, he asked her if he could pray with her. We always wait for them to ask us for prayer. Anyway, he asked her if he could pray with her. Mom nodded. Well, yes, she was Christian and he was Christian, but there the similarity ended. His prayer was very much a Baptist prayer and very little like a Catholic prayer. I remember a lot of Lords in there, about every fourth or fifth word. Afterward, it was a fine prayer, but it was his prayer, not her prayer. And he didn't tailor it much to her spiritual needs. Afterward, she didn't want him to come back. Basically, homebound at that point, she asked me to go to the local Catholic church and request a visit from the priest. So this lapsed Catholic, a Unitarian Universalist since I was 19, graced the doors of St. Sebastian Catholic Church in my mom's Florida town. I met with the church secretary and told her mom's story. Businesslike when I first entered, she quickly became compassionate. She apologized on behalf of the church and told me the church doesn't do that anymore, excommunicate people for remarriage. Within the week, my mom had a visit from the Catholic priest. He gave my mother the act of reconciliation, which brought her back into good standing. It was good for my mom. It kind of pissed me off because she should have been giving them the act of reconciliation, but that's a whole nother story. That act brought her back into good standing with the church, and he heard her confession and gave her communion. And then she did die a few months later, able to then have the Catholic funeral mass she wanted, a sacrament which she would not have been able to have without having had that act of reconciliation. Churches often disenfranchise believers for many reasons, sometimes by not acknowledging certain relationships or by not seeing certain deaths as worthy of ceremonial recognition. And sometimes this varies by how liberal the denomination is. In some churches, still, obviously, a gay couple is not recognized or supported. Obviously, that would not be the case, thankfully, in our congregation, in our denomination. But even in the most liberal of congregations, there is unlikely to be a funeral for pets, although we often have blessings for pets, which is lovely. There's unlikely to be funerals for babies lost from miscarriage, a ceremony to mark the loss of a child being given up for adoption, a ceremony to mark the loss from an abortion. The lack of recognition of these losses often alienates those surviving. Fearing judgment encourages further withdrawal. Their cloaks are invisible shades of red. Consider for a moment the many functions of funerals and memorial services. They confirm the reality of a death. They assist in the expression of grief, while simultaneously offering a structure that contains that grief. They allow grievers to do something. They offer structured activities at an otherwise disorganized time. They stimulate the recollections of the deceased. They provide social support to the bereaved, reaffirming their new identity and reincorporating them into the larger community in their new role. The wife, now the widow, an obvious example. But the benefits of funerals and memorial services, are often enhanced when allowing for the participation of significant others. Loved ones giving the eulogy, sharing memories of the deceased, putting out photos which often include surviving loved ones. For the disenfranchised griever, however, funerals typically offer little to no benefit. The disenfranchised griever is not expected or allowed to participate, maybe not even allowed to attend. The photo board at the memorial service is unlikely to include the extramarital lover, maybe even the ex-spouse. They are unlikely to be getting up to speak. These grievers are ignored, unacknowledged, illegitimate. And often others are unaware of the needs of these survivors, or maybe don't even know they exist. Their cloaks are invisible shades of red. As an interfaith chaplain, when I served in a pediatric hospital, I was often asked to perform baptisms in cases of people from out of the area who didn't already have a local priest or minister to do that, but also people disenfranchised from their childhood faith, often ex-Catholics who felt pulled to these old familiar rituals, even though their theology was no longer congruent with that denomination. Or they felt like they couldn't ask a priest since they were a gay couple. More shades of red. I once held a mini memorial service for a dog in a hospital room. A 3-year-old girl was in our pediatric hospital with cancer, and the family dog died. The single mom put up a framed photo of the dog, and the small bald-headed girl drew pictures and talked about Fluffy. I read scripture as the mom requested. The girl, I don't think, really understood what was happening. The mom, understandably, was a mess, with her child's life in the balance, projecting all that anticipatory grief onto the dog. She wore many shades of red. As a chaplain in a pediatric hospital, it was not uncommon for me to encounter parents who blamed their child's illness or death, or on something they, the parent, had done, some past sin, real or imagined. The mothers who blamed their child's illness on their own abortion they had had years before, for an example. They felt ashamed. Can we open our hearts to those whose red cloak, whose loss is due to a sense of shame? As a chaplain, I've handled cases of disenfranchisement, sometimes better, sometimes poorly, sometimes not at all. In one of my better visits, in a visit with a young Muslim mom at the pediatric hospital I served, in my initial moments, I confronted the elephant in the room, as it were. There was great anti-Muslim sentiment in the country then, and there were frequent news reports of Muslims being harassed or beaten. I was somewhat anxious walking to her room and sensed this invisible wall between us as soon as I walked in. She was tense and quite wary of me. I introduced myself as the chaplain and immediately followed that with, "I'm so sorry for what's happening in our nation right now." The wall came down instantly. I stayed with her for a long while as she shared her story about her child's health, but also about how tough things were out in the world for her and her family then. From out of the area, she did not have any local Islamic support. From our pastoral care department's supply closet, I brought her an English Quran. She had never read her holy scriptures before because she had only ever seen Arabic ones, and she didn't read Arabic. She was excited to finally be able to read it for herself, and it seemed to give her comfort just to hold it, which I have witnessed countless times with Protestants and other Christian patients. Yes, one of my better visits. I recognized her red cloak. Now for one of my worst visits. I had been a student chaplain mere weeks when I was sent to a code blue on the PICU, the pediatric ICU, in the children's hospital where I did all my student chaplain required hours. The child coding had picked up her father's loaded gun, which he had left out on the coffee table. The toddler shot herself in the head. My job was to provide spiritual support to the young parents of the child. In the room, I found a weeping mother, a stoic-looking father, in opposite corners of the room, as several medical professionals frantically worked to keep their young daughter alive. I approached the weeping mom, who held a well-worn Bible in her hands, and introduced myself to her. She fell into my arms, and I held her for a long while as she wept. Eventually, she calmed some and asked me for prayer. I prayed with her, of course, asking God to save her child, and asking God and his angels to support this family in this tragic time. Eventually, the visit came to an end, and I left that room to provide spiritual support to others in the hospital. I never made eye contact with that father. He haunts me to this day. I don't wonder much about the girl or the mom, as odd as that might seem. It's the father I think about still, how I wasn't able to provide spiritual support to him. His negligence stunned me, paralyzed me, it enraged me. I had a lot of anger at him. His carelessness, his stupidity, his simple, thoughtless mistake that changed lives forever. I could not offer him any spiritual support because I was too full of judgment toward him. And when I look back on an experience, it hits me hard. How much pain he must have been in. His grief, his guilt, his shame, and perhaps his own fear about possible, probably likely criminal charges and maybe prison time. He needed spiritual care as much as that mom, maybe more so. But I was not ready to be the chaplain he needed then. And truthfully, years later, I am not sure I can be the chaplain he needs now. But I would have the courage to try. I'd have the courage to see the flaming shades of red of his cloak and offer my presence and my support. And that at least would be a start. I would not ignore him. About a year and a half ago, our area suffered the mass shooting tragedy that is a grossly common experience here in the US. A boy shot and killed his brother, and then continued his hunting and shooting spree in his neighborhood and on the Greenway. I think about his parents from time to time. I can't imagine their anguish. The heartbreak of losing the one son, the other son, the murderer of him and others. I can't imagine their pain. I can't imagine their shame. Their possible, maybe likely guilt in their complicitness of what was going on in their house leading up to that. Can we have space in our hearts for people whose red cloak is woven with the darkest of shame? To some extent, all grief and loss is disenfranchised in our death-denying culture, or becomes disenfranchised over time. We all expect people, whatever their grief or loss, to get over it eventually, get on with life. We expect there to be an end point, even in the worst cases of grief. But we are all wearing shades of cloaks of red, more or less, and we live our lives surrounded by others wearing invisible cloaks of red. How can we see it? How can we, as caring people, help support those in pain around us? Check in with those you know have had a loss, even if that loss was a long time ago and you think they will be over it by now. Offer to be a safe space for them to grieve. Let them know you will listen if they want to talk about it. Listen to their story. The information I shared about funerals was to remind us how important rituals are. Rituals are often deprived to disenfranchised grievers, for those suffering losses unacknowledged, those whose red cloaks are invisible. Sometimes just listening, just being this safe space, this listening friend can be enough. That allows the sufferers to name their loss. It validates their loss. But ritual is important and may be a welcome and necessary activity. Maybe your friend's conversation brought up their loved one's favorite activities or favorite foods. You could offer to shop for or make a special meal of these foods with their survivor, or go out to eat that favorite food with them. Offer to join them in a private funeral, crafting that with them, taking ideas from the stories of their loved one that they shared with you. Their loved one loved roses, maybe offer to help them plant a rose bush. That could be part of the ceremony or all of it. Or if their loved one loved taking hikes in the woods, offer to go walking in the woods with them. Rituals should always stem from their story, though, their narrative of the loss. After all, it's their loss, not yours. What if it is your loss? What if you are the disenfranchised griever? What if your cloak is a hidden scarlet? Try to find safe people to share your story with. Trust a friend, maybe a counselor, maybe a spiritual advisor. Acknowledging your grief validates your bond to your loved one and facilitates self-care. I encourage you to create your own rituals, even if they're private. Light a candle, fix a special meal, listen to special music, write a letter to them. Maybe then burn it afterwards. Journal on your experiences. Leave something on their gravesite. Rituals affirm the loss and allow gratitude for the relationship. Creating your own rituals will help you to allow yourself to grieve. Remind you that your person is not forgotten, that your relationship to that person is not forgotten, that it was real, that it is real. My mom is still my mom, even though she's gone. Rituals can help bring a sense of validation, of closure, and it can help you to find forgiveness if need be. Asking forgiveness from them, or you forgiving them if you can be part of your ritual and can be a healing and holy act. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Today, of course, is Easter, a mythological story to most of us UUs. But consider the story for a moment. Can we imagine the pain of Jesus' followers, their shame that their friend and leader was arrested and tried and put to death? Peter denies him 3 times, the story tells us. So great was his shame and fear of being associated with a criminal. And Mary's pain, a mother's worst nightmare. Her son branded a criminal and put to death. The Easter story, though, is one of a great miracle of love triumphing over the greatest of losses, death. We all know loss and pain and grief. We all wear cloaks with some shade of red. To close, using Easter metaphor, let us roll away the stones that close our hearts to those in pain around us. And if we are the ones in pain, let us be courageous enough to find someone to share the story of our grief with. Let us see the shades of red around us. Let us care for one another. Let us be examples of love triumphing over loss and pain and death. Amen, and blessed be.